I'm pleased to be joined by Andrea Batista Schlesinger, who since 2002 has served as the executive director of the nonprofit Drum Major Institute for Public Policy. Welcome to CityWide.
Thank you.
So we're talking about what some people refer to as policy entrepreneurs or policy shops. And the Drum Major Institute name sounds like it's a place where you go to learn how to be in a marching band. So tell us the derivation of the name and what the mission of the organization is.
At least the name sticks out. The Drum Major Institute does not give music lessons, but we were founded during the civil rights movement by Harry Wachtell and other lawyers and advisors to Dr. King, actually here in New York. And King would refer to that group as his think tank. And the name comes from a theme of Dr. King's, where he would talk about the drum major instinct, that instinct to lead others, how it could be used for good, how it could be used for bad. It was actually the theme of his last sermon at Ebenezer Church before he was killed. And when the organization was recreated again a few years ago, we decided to keep that name and to do what we did then, which was try to provide ideas and tools, as we did then, to fuel the larger movement for social and economic justice.
So what is the mission or focus of the organization?
We're trying to generate the tools that will enable people on the front lines to better advocate for an agenda of social and economic justice. And those tools are research, they're models of effective policy, new ways of communicating ideas, whatever it is that will enable advocates, organizers, candidates, elected officials, bloggers, whoever the audience is, to better do their job. That's our job.
The founding president of the organization, Fernando Ferrer, during his political career, talked eloquently about there being two New Yorks. How does that theme relate to the kind of work that you do?
A lot of the work that the Drum Major Institute does is focused on this notion of a middle-class squeeze. We look at policy through the lens of what's the impact on the current and aspiring middle class. And in the beginning, when we did that, we actually got a little bit of flack. You know, why would you focus on the middle class when we have such entrenched poverty? And our case was, and as we have sought to illustrate through years of work, is that as our country becomes increasingly one of the very wealthy, and everyone else, that really the interests of the poor and the middle class are in alignment. And I think that was at the heart of what Freddie was talking about in his campaign and what he had been talking about for a long time before, which is if you don't have a strong middle class, there's nothing for the poor to work their way into.
I think that, except for the very, very rich, most people want to be in the middle class, or at least be perceived in the middle class. If you're at the bottom, you want to move up.
Right.
And if you're just above middle class, you don't necessarily want to be ostentatious because you're probably having problems paying your kids' tuition bills.
Well, that definitely is part of the strategic decision to look at policy through that lens, is that in this country almost everybody identifies as middle class, which we think is something that can be used to our advantage in presenting that really we're all in this together. So how do we find the policy agenda that would enable all of us to either hold on to our middle class state of being with a little bit more security, or to work our way up into it?
Give me a for instance of the kinds of programs that you operate.
We do research. We try to look at models of successful policy from around the country, in part because, and this is maybe contrary to the typical way that think tanks do business or are perceived as this, insulated ivory tower conversation. And that's very much not what the Drum Major Institute's approach is, as you can tell from the name, but in our programming as well. That's not our approach. So instead of just talking rhetoric, our view is what's the best way to inspire people to implement progressive policy to show where it's worked elsewhere. So we bring in policymakers from around the country who have had demonstrable success. They've pushed forward policy that's practical, that's effective, and that's progressive. And we bring those people in throughout the year to tell their stories, in part because we want to counter the notions, even of some institutes based here in New York, that government is the problem. But also, we want copycatting. We want people to be inspired to replicate the policies that are working elsewhere.
What's an example of a successful policy that New York could adopt?
Well, we had a state senator in from Oklahoma a few months ago who created and ushered through legislation to create their universal pre-K system, the most effective in the country. State senator from Maine came in shortly thereafter to talk about what she did to enable Maine to negotiate directly with drug companies, which has really brought down the cost of drugs for working people there. In a week, we'll have the Minnesota Attorney General who will talk about what she has done to pass what's viewed as the strongest anti-predatory mortgage lending bill in the country. I mean, there's so many examples of policy out there that's working. No need to always start from scratch, even in a place like New York that's original.
And do policymakers in New York respond well to those kinds of examples?
They do. They love it.
Because there's this, whole New York attitude that
Right.
if we didn't think of it, it can't be worth anything.
Right, and as a native New Yorker, I understand that attitude. But actually, we get calls from policymakers. Just last week, we facilitated a call from a Republican upstate state senator who was really interested in what Maine had done around making pharmaceuticals more affordable. So we brought together the Maine state senator and this state's Republican from upstate and facilitated a phone call between the two of them so that they could perhaps, move something here in New York. People love models. We had a city council person interested in what Minnesota had done to create more subsidy accountability. They love it. Because then they don't have to start from scratch.
And how do you disseminate your information? Is it just about seminars for key opinion leaders? Is it publications? How do you get the message out?
Well, we have an internal motto that probably drives the staff crazy. But if it isn't read, it wasn't written. And again, challenging the way that think tanks operate. So it's not enough to just put a pretty cover on something or not put a pretty cover on it and send it out and say, my job is done. So we do everything we can to make the work viral so that it has a life of its own. And one of the things that we've developed a reputation for is really using the internet to that end. So we have several internet properties. We have our own website. We have 2 blogs that several thousand people visit every day. And we create material that other bloggers can use with ease so that they can talk about policy just as readily as they can talk about politics. Thank you. DrumMajorInstitute.org, and our policy blog is dmiblog.com.
You alluded a moment ago to some of the conservative think tanks, and we'll talk about those in a second, but I want to start with the very big picture of government as the problem or government as the solution. It seems to me that from the Roosevelt era to the Reagan era, the momentum was all in pretty much in one direction. And Reagan, for better or for worse, challenged a lot of the assumptions about the role of government and shifted the debate in ways that probably went beyond even his own expectations. But we're in an era now, or in a presidential election season now, where perhaps because the theories on both sides haven't necessarily lived up to their promise, where I think the electorate is up for grabs, that they're not quite sure whether government is the problem or perhaps the government is at least part of the solution. Tell me how you see that debate unfolding.
Well, it's a complicated debate, but I think one of the things that we were thrilled to see in 2006 with the midterm elections was this wide-scale rejection of the government as problem narrative. And although many think that the election was just a referendum on the war, if you look at the polling data closely, it was as much about economic anxiety and a sense that we want people who are going to do something about that anxiety, who are going to represent our interests. And that's a good direction. And I don't think it's an unusual direction. I think there are many times in our country where there's a sense that wealth is becoming aggregated at the top and that policy is supporting that direction. And then people say, hey, what I actually want is a bill that's going to enable me to not have to choose between saving for my own retirement and putting my kids through college when the average value of a Pell Grant hasn't increased and so on. And when airlines have an easier time recovering from bankruptcy than a middle-class person who was faced with a healthcare crisis. So I do think that there is a moment now in which people want government to take action. And that's positive. So now the question is, what do we do with that? And that's part of why DMI focuses so much on models, because there are things that we can do that will actually improve the quality of people's lives.
So there's a difference between an academic think tank and an advocacy think tank. And in part, the advocacy think tank starts with a perspective: government is bad. The private, or maybe it's not government is bad, but the private sector is more efficient and responsible, or perhaps a perspective that says that that government is more moral because it's not driven solely by the bottom line, but can take into effect the impact that decisions have on people's lives. Does that affect the research? I'm talking in general, obviously, in terms of the drum major, but in terms of all of the organizations in your field, does the fact that you start with a point of view, or that some start with a point of view, color the research that you do as well as the advocacy?
Well, I think the same question could probably be asked of journalists, of politicians. There are different purposes for think tanks. Some are interested in a project of dispassionate research, and that's important. Number crunching, processing data, that's good. That's one role. There are other think tanks that are interested in shaping the larger public conversation. And, one of the things that's happened over the last several years, certainly from when I started at the Drum Major Institute in 2002, which seems like forever ago, there wasn't even a recognition that think tanks on the progressive side were important. And now, I think, as people have really delved into what has the conservative right been able to accomplish over the last 30 years, there's a sense that you have to not just focus on a policy agenda, you need to focus on the very shape of the conversation in which a discussion about policy takes place. And that's the role that the Drum Major Institute plays. Let's set the table for a conversation, shape the way people think about ideas in ways that they may not even realize they're thinking about, but which have a direct relationship to the policies that they're going to support or oppose, the policies that they think impact them or that they think don't impact them. So you have to set the table. That's what the think tanks of the conservative right have done so well, and that's the project that we have taken on. Does that mean we're biased? I don't think so. We would certainly never assert something that wasn't true. But we are invested in creating tools that will enable people to better make a case. And so to that end, we're invested in the outcome of the debate.
We will continue our conversation about that policy conversation when CityWide continues right after this.
Once you see the world through math and science, you'll never see anything the same way again. Go to girlsgotech.org.
You'll see.
Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with Andrea Batista Schlesinger, the Executive Director of the Drum Major Institute. Are you a national organization or a local organization?
It's a good question. We're both. And what we wanted to do was really follow the model, very successful model of a think tank based here in New York, the Manhattan Institute. To use New York as a laboratory and to take what we've learned from New York and telegraph it nationally. To take what's happening nationally and apply it to New York. And so everything that we do has this dance between New York and national. And as we know, whatever happens in New York is a national story, and we are in the media capital of the country. So that dance is one that we're able to execute, without much difficulty. It's certainly one of our beliefs that it doesn't make sense to be a think tank in a place that you have no connection to. And it's one of our critiques of the insulated beltway think tanks, is that they're based in DC but don't really interact in any way with their surroundings to put their ideas to work. And that's something that we do.
So let's take an issue that is being debated on the national level now that reflects this ideological divide between the roles of the private and public sectors, and where the think tanks are weighing in left and right, and that's healthcare. Is it a crisis in New York? Is there one solution? Is there a New York model that can be applied nationally, or as you referenced before with some of the programs that are being developed elsewhere, is New York lagging behind from a policy point of view?
a few months ago, we wanted to explore this question of how the middle class in New York City was faring. So we did a survey of about 100 leaders across the ideological spectrum, businesses, small and large, politicians, academics, and we asked them what they thought about the state of the middle class today in the city, and to identify top challenges. And being able to afford decent health care was one of those top challenges, in addition to an overwhelming, or in the context of an overwhelming response that it is harder, significantly harder today, to be middle class in New York City than it was even 10 years ago. So there's no question that there is anxiety about health care in this city, and certainly in this state. And, you know, I don't think there's much when it comes to health care that we're leading the national debate on. But I do think that there is a lot of hunger to do something here that would provide a national model. I mean, the governor's efforts to implement children's health insurance, regardless of the president's directive to limit the program. So I think there's interesting energy, and there certainly are shops that are thinking about it, both in terms of New York and national. But it does come down to the ideological divide. And do you think this is government's business, or don't you? I mean, the president is quite clear in his refusal to broaden the eligibility for children, for children's health insurance nationally, to include many of those children of squeezed middle class parents who can't afford health insurance, especially when the jobs that are replacing those that were lost during the recession increasingly come without benefits, and people are, you know, not fixed to traditional employment the way they were. You know, he's very clear this is going to lead to a socialist state of affairs. And so you have to get to the heart of those questions. You can't just do policy papers and forums and seminars in isolation and pretend that there isn't a broader ideological conversation that's taking place that underlies whichever approach we pursue. And those kinds of questions, those kinds of gritty questions, are the ones that the Drum Major Institute is engaged in.
So how do you break through the sloganeering that passes for political discourse? This morning I was reading a column in one of the daily newspapers, and the author said that he had a debate with Lee Bollinger, the president of Columbia University, on affirmative action. And he began and it was talking about Bollinger's style of rhetoric and intellectual approach. And he said that they had, you know, he was prepared to sort of categorize the debate when he started it. He was going to reel off sort of his top 10 slogans, my words, not his, and he was, you know, anticipating, and Bollinger was going to reel off his sort of top 10 slogans on the other side of the affirmative action debate. That seems to happen a lot, and it makes it very difficult to for elected officials, for public officials, to tune out the clutter and focus in on what's actually new or relevant to the particular decision that's being made. So how do you break through that?
Well, the idea that there's clutter and rhetoric in the process of politics and policy is not one that the Drum Major Institute is prepared to solve. However, you know, there are a couple of things that we try to do to break through that clutter. The first is we do these scorecards each year of how members of Congress voted on issues of significance to the current and aspiring middle class. And scorecards aren't going to save the world, we know that. But it provides a way for people to get to the substance, which is your representative actually acting in your interests? Not a single issue scorecard, you know, an NRA or a Planned Parenthood thing where it's just but an actual overall, when it comes to the range of policies from health care to pension security to education, in general, is this person that you've elected advancing your interests? And it's scary. And we give people grades, and then we publicize those grades, and we try to use innovative ways to get those grades out. We did a Google campaign last year where if you Googled any member of Congress, an ad would pop up with their grade, and those were viewed 24 million times in the 6 months before the 2006 election. And that kind of pressure, I think, will enable people on the other side, the politicians and their staffs, to keep their eye on the prize when they know that people are actually watching and that the general public is equipped to be able to assess that person's performance. I think that's a little bit of an encouragement to not just dwell in the land of rhetoric, but to actually get a clear sense of what it is that they're supposed to do when they know that their constituents are watching.
So something like your scorecard, instead of slicing issues vertically, say the way the League of Conservation Voters
Right.
would on an environmental issue. You're slicing the issues horizontally. How do each of these things, crime, education, environment, how do they impact on the middle class and working class in the country?
It's important because people don't view issues. I mean, you don't wake up today and say today's healthcare day. You only care about healthcare because it's also happening in the context of your job security, which is also happening in the context of your retirement security. And it's the way the institutions function, but it's not the way people function. And of course, there are people who are more motivated by one issue than another, in the environment or education. But in general, what we need are more tools that connect people and their lives to the policies that determine the quality of those lives.
And how does, obviously, when you're focused on the middle class, the word class kind of jumps out at you. How does class relate to race and geography in a city like New York?
Well, everything that we look at is at the intersection of race, class, and geography. I mean, there's no way to tease out those issues. So it's pretty much a given in any conversation, whether you're talking about education or healthcare. But the idea is, and this is our project, how do you demonstrate that issues that are previously viewed as separating people are actually issues that can be uniting people? So for example, last year we did a lot of work around immigration in the middle class. How do you demonstrate that the current and aspiring middle class, the vast kind of middle of America, that it's in their best interest to have a progressive immigration policy as well? One of the things the right has done so well is to separate people. It's the poor versus the working class. And one of the things that we need to do if we really want to advance a progressive agenda is to question who our friends are, and to view our shared economic interests as encompassing more than our single issue or our income brackets agenda. And that's a project that the Drum Major Institute is engaged in.
So let me take a local issue, congestion pricing. You're on the commission that's looking at it. I'm not asking you how you're going to come out in terms of the outcome, but from the Drum Major Institute's perspective, tell me the kinds of things that the organization would want considered in that discussion when it comes to class, race, and geography.
Sure. It's a good example of, do we think on a micro level about an agenda, or do we think more broadly? So you have some who would say this is a middle class tax, and this is against the interests of the middle class in a way that I think perpetuates this notion that it's a small group of people who all earn the same amount and live a certain way versus everyone else. Or you think in a macro way, what's best for the city? And is it best for the city's middle class that everyone be able to breathe, that businesses be able to function? And that's our view. So we don't use the middle class language in a cynical way to just appeal to a small group of people who are actually going to be impacted, but to think more broadly about what are in the best interests of the city.
But you can solve those policy objectives in a lot of different ways. You can do something with congestion by having more enforcement. In other words, the mayor set forth a policy solution, and now it's being measured against its impact rather than being measured against other policy solutions.
Well, that's the job of the commission. So the job of the commission is to come up with a plan that will actually reduce congestion, and that's the goal. And so it's important that we don't get into a conversation about, is this a tax or isn't this a tax? Is this hurting the middle class outer borough taxpayer or not? But we all have a goal here. The goal is to reduce congestion because that's in the best interest of the city and everyone who lives here. So how do we do that? And sure, there are going to be a lot of plans and ideas on the table. I don't think anyone thinks that the plan that the mayor proposed, just as he proposed it, is the one that is going to become reality. My fear, though, is that by appealing to this sense, this notion that has really been perpetuated, again, by our counterparts on the right of a middle class burdened by taxes, that we will lose an opportunity to not only reduce congestion, but to provide much needed revenue that's going to benefit the overwhelming majority of this city, since only 5% of New Yorkers actually drive into the central business district during working hours. So are we going to think in a micro level about how do we most appeal to those 5% of people? Or are we going to think in a macro way, how do we get much needed public transportation to the 95% of people who aren't driving into the central business district? So what kind of policy approach are we going to take?
Well, regardless of the outcome of that debate, it's good to know that there are people, whether it's the Manhattan Institute, or others from one perspective, and certainly the Drum Major Institute with the perspective that you've articulated that are actually thinking about these kinds of decisions. My thanks to Andrea Batista Schlesinger, the Executive Director of the Drum Major Institute for Public Policy. I'm Ken Fisher. Thank you for joining us on this edition of CityWide.